we see that women are roughly 25% less likely to use these new AI tools than men. I think overall, the biggest concern I have is that it's lost productivity, lost new ventures, lost economic growth. But we want to make sure no matter who you are in the world, if you come to AI with your specific problems, that it can meet your needs where you are and where you're coming from. How do we broaden the benefits of entrepreneurship so that more people can build and build for more people? What we find is that there's an opportunity for AI to improve performance for those entrepreneurs who are already doing well, but there's also a risk that it can worsen the performance for those who are struggling. And I think this is something that we're gonna have to grapple with as we see AI help more entrepreneurs, help more people in developed economies, help more people in emerging economies. My name is Koning. I am the Mary and Mark Stevens Associate Professor at Harvard Business School, and I research entrepreneurship all over the world. There's a big question right now on who's using generative AI and who's benefiting from this surprisingly powerful new technology. And so I got really interested in whether there were gender gaps in who was using these tools, partly inspired by an RA who worked with me. Right? I noticed that in my meetings, I was talking to a lot of guys about what AI could do, what multimodal models were there, how to talk to ChatGPT, whether you should use Claude or you should use Gemini. And I realized these conversations tended to be with other guys. And so we started looking at the data to see if this was something that we could see more broadly, we could see systematically. And what we find is that no matter where you look in the world, what occupation you look at, we see that women are roughly 25% less likely to use these new AI tools than men. When we think about why women are using AI less than men, we just don't know yet. There's some evidence in the data that it's a little bit explained, something like a third, by the sorts of jobs and tasks men and women do, right? We just know there are more male programmers than female programmers, and programmers tend to use AI more than non-programmers. I think overall, the biggest concern I have is that it's lost productivity, lost new ventures, lost economic growth. We know from recent estimates coming out of Harvard Business School, coming out of other great universities, that these AI tools can unlock a huge amount of productivity. Some estimates up to 50 to 100% increases. If women aren't using these tools at work, that's productivity that society and these women aren't bringing into the economy, right? That's lost growth, lost job opportunity, lost promotions opportunity. Second, we lose out on AI tools that could potentially benefit women. So in a lot of my research, I've looked at not just who entrepreneurs are, but who they build for. If we don't have women engaging with AI, we're likely to lose out on applying AI to specifically women's problems. I think there's a third thing that's important, which is that AI is not always good. Right? We can see, just like with social media, there can be downsides. So maybe there's a little bit of reason of optimism that women are more cautious about engaging with these tools before we've fully worked out the costs and the benefits. I think the first thing you can do is learn from my experience, and that's to talk to both men and women in your organization about AI, right? Open up the conversation, make sure it's not an old boys club. Right? Make sure you're talking to everybody, no matter their background, about these tools. I think the second thing we need to do is build trainings that include everyone in our organizations, in our schools, and in our firms. Right? If we're not training everybody in how to think about and use these tools, the costs and the benefits, often just by choice, we're going to end up with more men taking advantage of this opportunity than women. One of the things that's really important about these systems is they learn from their users. Not just the data the model was trained on, but the interaction data is being tuned towards men. And so unless companies like Anthropic, like OpenAI, like Google are careful in how they're training their models and accounting for these gender gaps and who is using their platform, they can potentially come to serve the needs of men better, potentially leading to women using the tools less because they're less tuned to their needs, leading to this sort of self-reinforcing cycle. And I think this is one of the things that we want to make sure that AI can serve the needs of men and women differently. So I think understanding, are you asking subtly different questions? Are they asking different topics? Are not just a sort of like, oh, men and women are going to use these technologies differently, but we want to make sure no matter who you are in the world, if you come to AI with your specific problems, that it can meet your needs where you are and where you're coming from. We recruited 640 small business entrepreneurs in Kenya. We gave 320 a PDF describing how to run their business, and we gave 320 access to GPT-4o, which now feels kind of old, over WhatsApp, so they could talk with a business advisor that we had built. And then we compared these two groups, seeing how they performed. What we found was really unexpected. So overall, when we compare those who have AI to those who don't, we see no difference, which is like really wild. It's like this powerful AI technology, what's going on? And the reason is because there's really big differences depending on where you start. If you were performing well before, you were an entrepreneur who had good profits, good revenues, you were doing well, you could successfully use these AIs to increase the performance of your business in terms of revenues, in terms of profits, by 10 to 15%. You knew how to take the advice from the AI that was really valuable and implement it in your business. Conversely, the entrepreneurs who are already struggling with running their businesses, who had lower profits, they had lower revenues before our experiment, they actually did worse, about 10% worse, 8 to 10% worse. Why? They did worse because they didn't know how to pick the good advice from the bad advice. If you just go ask ChatGPT for business advice, it's going to spit 30 ideas back at you. Where the human still comes in is you have to know which one's the right one to implement for you. The businesses that were struggling didn't have the judgment, didn't have the skill, maybe didn't have the capital to pick the right advice from that list, and ended up putting into place things that were kind of easy but don't help, like lowering your prices. If you drop your prices 10% and you don't sell more, guess what? You're making 10% less money. And we think this really speaks to the uneven impact that AI is going to have on the economy, which is that we need to think about not just how it might benefit those who are already doing well, but also how it might benefit those who are struggling as well. One of the things we found in this study that's really interesting is that we find that female entrepreneurs in Kenya in our study were also less likely to use the AI than male entrepreneurs, consistent with our work looking at these gaps across the globe, right? And so whether you're looking at a computer programmer, whether you're looking at a consultant, whether you're looking at someone running a small business in Kenya, we still find these same gender gaps, which was really surprising to us and concerning, leading to our work on this issue. Why I got interested is a personal one, right? It came down to when my wife had our daughter. And, like all new parents, you're tired, you're struggling. My wife works in tech, and she looked around and was like, oh my God, the tech offerings for new parents are abysmal. And they are just terrible. And let's look at what is being built. And she starts looking at all these companies. And lo and behold, you've got a lot of, let's say, 21-year-old bros who have started these companies and maybe hadn't done enough user research, hadn't gained the user empathy. And there was a shocking lack of women, even in a space where you'd think there'd be a lot of women inventing for the needs of women because maybe they'd experienced it themselves, or they're less likely to dismiss these problems. So that got me thinking of do we see this problem of the sort of bias that we experienced, right? As my wife experienced as a new mom, right? Do we see that in larger data? Do we see that when we look at all inventions in the United States? And so we focused on biomedical inventions, and we started digging into the patent data. And this is the early days of AI. And we were like, hey, maybe we could use some of these AI tools to classify patents as focused on women's health or not focused on women's health, and then look at who's more likely to invent them. What we find is that women are substantially more likely, 40% more likely, to invent for women than men. Right? And we can see this across different areas of the biomedical sciences. We can see it within diseases. We can see it not just in patenting, but we can see it upstream. When we look at scientific research, women are more likely to do research that is going to benefit women, and men are not. And this gap is held over decades, right? We've seen some shrinking of the gap, primarily due, however, to the entry of women into the biomedical sciences. And so our concern was, oh my gosh, maybe in a society where we equalize the probability that men and women can be inventors, we get the right mix of innovation for men and women. But if we've got 90% of the inventors who are men, right, and they seem to be a little bit more dismissive or less likely to even see some of these problems just because they haven't experienced them, maybe we're ending up with a society where we have too few inventions aimed at the needs of women. On the one hand, our paper with inventors says maybe it's hard to find that founder, right, who can really spark a new women's health startup idea. We have in a paper that should be coming out in a couple months, what we find in that data is that startups that focus on women also struggle to find the joiners they need for their firms. Why is that the case? Startup employees are guys. If you look at the data, right, only 1 in 5 early stage startup employees is a woman. And if you look at men and you say, hey, do you want to work on this startup idea that's maybe working on endometriosis research versus back pain research? They will say no. And then you can ask them, why? Why don't you want to work on this? And sometimes it's reason like they're like, I don't understand the problem. It hasn't affected me. I'm uncomfortable working on it. Sometimes you just get answers like, why would I help women? I'm not one, right? And so we see this different forms of biases, right, at the stage in terms of where you can find founders. The end result is that if you're a woman founder or a male founder working on a startup that's appealing to women, you're going to have to pay tens of thousands of dollars more a year to get equivalent quality candidates than if you're working on a startup idea that's gender neutral or focused on the needs of men. The core piece of advice I would give someone who's interested in building a startup aimed at the needs of women or any other sort of underserved group, right, is one, acknowledge the reality that you're going to be facing an uphill battle. I think this is where you need to lean into other aspects of your idea that can be exciting, right? And so one is make sure you're showing that your idea is just as disruptive as an idea that's gender neutral or focused on men. I think often we lean into the social mission framing because there really is big social impacts. But at the end of the day, VCs and most startup employees, what do they care about? They care about money. They care about the success of your startup. They care about how much you're going to scale, right? And so my big actionable piece of advice would be go find that comparison of another startup that's been successful that you're like. Maybe they are building for different sorts of people than you're building for. That's okay, but they have the same business model or similar sorts of technology. Doing that, I think, can help you close the gap and attract the resources and the joiners you need to build a great company. In terms of great examples that we might see, I think one is Flow, which does menstrual tracking. Really asset light, grew fast, could clearly show the numbers, right? They're a $1 billion unicorn startup right now. And I think they both leaned into the social middle internally. They use that to find female founders and joiners for their startup, but they were also open. Another one that's an excellent example is Maven, a women's health clinic that has just done phenomenally well. Again, really leaned into the business model and the technology, and the market really mattered, don't get me wrong, but we're able to use that to say, hey, we're building this next great health tech platform. This is going to be amazing and disruptive. It happens to benefit women, right? And I think those are two great examples of ways you can overcome some of these barriers that you might face in building these ideas.